Welcome back to the Transatlantic Tech Talk. Today's episode is titled The Great Reset. We believe that a few of the key events that played out over the past 2 weeks actually ushered in a new era and a complete reset for the relationship between Europe and the US.
In this episode, Stefan and I will be discussing and analyzing for you what the AI summit in Paris, the Munich Security Conference, and the German elections happen on Sunday mean for business, startups, and venture capital. It's great to have you with us. Let's dive right in.
All right, here we go again. Hello from San Francisco, California. Good to be with my fabulous co-host, Veronica, to break down all recent developments in the transatlantic relationship as pertains to the EU, the United States, how their relationship is evolving, as well as recent developments in markets, tech, and all those implications. In preparing for this episode, we had a little discussion around what the best framework is because a ton has happened in the last 2 weeks since our last podcast. And we thought a right theme and frame is the Great Reset because we're really living in a time where the transatlantic relationship is being redefined, like as we speak. We had a couple of moments in the last 2 weeks that really showed how there's a completely new vibe and energy in the conversation and discussion between the United States and its European allies, if we still want to call them that. And yeah, we're gonna highlight some of those key moments and speeches, some of the developments there, and try and give you some behind the scenes context as to what the mood is like in Brussels these days. Right, Veronica?
Thank you, Stefan, for kicking us off. I think, well, isn't it so timely to have the third episode of our Transatlantic Tech Talk? And basically, everything is being questioned right now. Is there still any transatlantic relationship, or is it, just over? It seems a little bit like a messy divorce happening in front of all of our eyes on the world stage. And the last 2 weeks, basically, we've seen all of these milestones with the summits, public statements issued by the Trump administration, notably JD Vance and Pete Hegseth, but of course Trump himself. And I think we talked about the big reckoning last time already in Europe and the EU, but I think right now it feels more like, so it's official. We're divorcing, and this is over. So it's more like we just need to figure out who are our new allies and what can we do to make sure that both in the business world, in terms of tariffs and trade, and of course in tech, and also with foreign relations, that our interests are secured. But I fully agree. It's been a lot lately, and I'm really excited to dive into all the topics with you today. I think it basically started during the AI summit in Paris. We mentioned it last time. It's one of one of the main events the tech and AI community had been looking forward to, and also kind of I certainly was excited to see what President Macron and the French had prepared. They are well known for being the best at, holding these summits, getting out the expensive China. And we've seen it the last time when President Trump visited. He certainly likes that as well. I think you can see that he likes to be, having a little bit of a bougie event and hosted in his name. But this time around, of course, we had big announcements in terms of funding, and I think really important steps in terms of AI funding, also from the European side, kind of catching up to Stargate. And the other side, of course, was the speech given by JD Vance. What was your perception? What was your tech bubble in the US talking about? Did you even
Yeah,
notice that the AI summit in Paris was happening?
to be honest, some of my friends went, European founders or people in the ecosystem. Obviously, most of the, I mean, all of the big, LLM labs, etc. CEOs went to both Paris and or Munich Security Conference. Most of them. But also in the media and like day-to-day conversation, obviously, it doesn't really come up as much. Um, as a reader of the Financial Times or like European news, it's something that kind of popped up. But two things that stood out to me. I think one, something nobody talks about ever, which was a big point in European news, was like, oh my God, Britain and the US didn't sign the resolution at the end of the summit. And I'm like, look, the resolution, again, in a classic European fashion, calls for, a very prudent approach and cautious approach and risk management and like higher regulation. So why would the UK and the US sign up? And honestly, I think one thing that we should talk about on a macro level, I think it's a very interesting kind of realignment of the UK. I think Brexit was obviously not an amazing, well thought out or executed, plan or idea from the very beginning, and the UK has struggled massively. But it does give them a level of arbitrage, right? It does give them the opportunity to kind of opt out of, to a certain extent, the European Union AI Act, of GDPR, again to a certain extent. So I do think we see a realignment and repositioning of the UK, even in the new Labour administration, in terms of trying to distance itself a little bit from the European approach and being a bit more laissez-faire and US style in its posture. So that's one observation, and then the other observation. Look, from a U.S. perspective, JD Vance's speech was perfectly on point, I would say, in many ways. He was like, "We are the number one country in AI. We run AI. We're going to continue to run AI." And he was basically saying, "It's us and China. Like, thank you, Europe. It's good to be here. I appreciate the grandeur of imperial, France and Paris all around me, but um, a, you don't really have too much of a role to play here, and B, um, you're on the wrong path. You're on the wrong track in trying to regulate this." But crucially, that is, you know, that is a vibe and a tone shift. Like I remember in the Biden days and the Obama days, of course, the US administration would always stand up for its companies and for their interests, right? So DC has always been very protective of Silicon Valley and the big tech companies in their engagement and in their fight, with Brussels in terms of fines, in terms of taxes, in terms of content moderation, whatever it may be. But it was hard to imagine Obama or Biden or their respective vice presidents to go up on a stage in Europe and basically tell the audience and tell the broader public, you're completely out of bounds. Like you're on the wrong track here. But that's what JD Vance did. So I kind of I respect that, but it's definitely a change of tone and atmosphere. And I think a lot of people in the room and in the various European capitals were kind of shook and were processing that for a couple of days. But then there was even more developments like that that followed in the coming days. But what was your perception, Veronica?
I mean, I have to say, I don't think it was just a little change in tone. It was, it wasn't even only assertive. It was just a completely different rule book he started playing. I've been in the diplomatic service. You have these certain kind of protocols, or the way you behave. It's all kind of customs and things you kind of play by, and he threw all of them out of the window. And I think also looking at, because he's been in Europe, obviously, also at the Munich Security Conference before, as a senator back then, and he's been invited before. And if you look at his speeches in Europe, I mean, that certainly for him was also, he was like a different person. We've seen different versions of JD Vance in the past, so that's not not new. But in terms of the way, also his concerns were voiced both in Paris at the AI summit and in Munich. That was certainly, yeah, you said shook. It was. I'm not even sure if it was a moment of shock, but it was like it's confirming everything we've been waiting for. It's a little bit like rip off the band-aid moment. For me, it felt like that. It's like we kind of knew it was coming, and here we are. So now cards are out in the open, and we know what the stakes are right now in an age of high political and geopolitical tension. And so for me, the Paris speech, which was obviously also very domestic speech for me. It was kind of this framework. He started it off with basically saying that we don't need to worry too much about jobs being lost to AI. He that was also the ending of his speech. So that was obviously the domestic part, directed at voters at home. We cannot really calculate right now how big the AI impact on the job market will be, but it certainly will be there. And for him, as a politician, I think he will also have to grapple with that. So he will need to be very smart about how he positions himself as the Silicon Valley tech guy. He's the one, showing the benefits of AI. But as soon as jobs are in peril, that's where it gets messy. So that's my first point. I also, and honestly, I think it's so interesting to see the UK's role, and especially Prime Minister Keir Starmer. You mentioned that they didn't sign the final agreement, and you can also see like nuances in their AI Security Institute. They have started since Trump has started his presidency, that they shift and change the wordings and their mission statement of the institute. So you see these subtle shifts, but all of that shows that they're trying to appease and close the gap to the US. But on the other hand, he has to rush to European leader summits, and making sure that showing them that he's their ally as well. So I think for UK government, they had also several some backlash about their budget and their tax plans. So basically saying that the businesses are leaving the UK and losing their AI edge, which I think the previous government did a good job in kind of establishing that. So I think that certainly was interesting to watch also during the AI summit in Paris. And I mean, for me, honestly, the big news, and also kind of a telling tale about how Europe is operating right now, was that we basically have this huge boost in AI funding, 150 billion from the EU for the Champions Initiative, and 109 billion euros just from France alone. So that's massive. It hasn't been like that before. Unheard of. Of course, it doesn't match yet the Stargate, but we had some answers prepared, but it seems just always a little bit too late and a little bit not enough. And I think that was just very telling that we had yet another moment where, similar to the Le Chat and DeepSeek, which we discussed during the last episode, we have what it takes, but we need to be quicker in presenting what we can offer to this global economy. And yeah, basically, this was kind of the overture to the Munich Security Conference, which then was even more of an eye-opening moment. And I actually was in Brussels while the security conference was happening. So I think that was the actual turning point. Kind of leading up to that, the statements by Pete Hegseth as well, and now JD Vance in Munich, not limiting his comments to the freedom of speech, but also basically giving recommendations for who to vote for in the German election that is happening on Sunday this weekend. The way it was kind of described was basically silence, and JD Vance even said himself like he doesn't think that he will get any applause from here on out anymore. So I think that was quite the self-reflective moment, and he was right in that.
Interesting. Yeah, I like your point about the UK. It's kind of sitting between these tables, like trying to play both sides. I think that's a very accurate observation. On the Munich Security Conference, I think it's definitely a very elite, discourse in the US. So I think outside the Silicon Valley, elite circles and the DC circles, it's not an event that people are aware of or that people follow, but it's obviously one of the biggest, security conferences started during the Cold War, and as one of the key global forums on um, defense and security. And so it's always a huge moment on the calendar of that community. And in the spring of each year, I happened to attend a couple of years back, and it's the density of let's say talent or global leadership is insane. I remember bumping into a former commissioner at the code check. I remember like literally rubbing shoulders into Draghi, like I almost like bumped into Draghi on the.
You got some European stardust on you.
Yeah, and he's quite a bit shorter in stature than I am, so that was also interesting to realize because you wouldn't, see that on TV necessarily. But anyways, aside from those personal anecdotes, and we had an interesting moment with Justin Trudeau, but that's for another episode.
We can
Um,
talk about Justin Trudeau and in a minute. I think there's something to
uh,
discuss here.
there you go. Look, I generally, I agree with your assessment, and it's in line with what I have, learned over here just from following the European discourse. It's rare, I think, for a U.S. vice president or secretary of state to go to Munich, deliver a speech, and talk about European domestic issues, and basically call out people, and or intervene in local elections that are going to be happening real soon in the host country, right? I mean, he was actually a visitor and a guest of the German administration, etc. That was also there in the front row. I remember even you can see when you look at the footage, right? And now I was obviously there. It's definitely a most European crowd, and especially like the patio orchestra seating in front of the stage is 70-80% kind of white male, relatively older European German distinguished gentlemen. You could tell, in their faces, kind of the general reaction and the general mood, which was not particularly thrilled. And look, I think there's substance to what he says, though. Like, one point I wanted to make is he's right to call out, immigration as an issue that Europe is struggling with and that Europe has to make progress on, similar to the U.S. We've seen both in Germany and Austria in recent weeks. Again, a number of security incidents and kind of tragedies that happened. So, as a matter of public safety, Europe and Central Europe does have to work on immigration and other issues. But then, of course, it gets a little more nuanced when you talk about freedom of speech, when you talk about, the AfD and like far right, parties in Germany and what their role should be in the German like constitutional framework. So let's say it's definitely a shots fired, kind of moment. Um, and yeah, the reaction was very strong by German political leadership in the room. I remember the German chancellor kind of taking the stage after JD Vance and responding also in very concrete and precise and somewhat aggressive terms. So we'll see. I think my personal take as well in terms of the personal relationships. I think the relationship with Macron is not great, but there's kind of a working relationship there. I think in their relationship with Scholz, they entered an ice age. Now Scholz most likely is not going to be chancellor of Germany going forward. We're going to talk about that, but I do think it'll be interesting to see who um, the new administration manages or wants to establish a relationship with, other than Meloni. And as we all know, as we were taught in school, and then when we were in Brussels or in Berlin or Vienna, in the various capitals, the Franco-German angle is critical to Europe. And so, ideally, we need strong leadership from a European perspective in both countries. And from a US perspective, if you want to work with Europe, you kind of have to get along with whatever the French and the German leadership may be at the time. And right now, that's clearly not the case. Let's see what that's going to look like, in a couple of months once we have the new German administration.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, what I found interesting is that apparently JD Vance had these one-on-ones and bilaterals before his speech. So he met the German leadership. The only one he met afterwards, and in those bilaterals before his speech, he was all like, we're going to cooperate, and we're going to work on our shared interests. Then he did his speech, so they didn't know what was going to happen like a couple of hours later. And then afterwards, he met the AfD, the far right party leader, Alice Weidel. So also, in setting that, just looking at the agenda, you can see what the priorities are and what kind of a game he's been playing. And uh, what I find difficult to decipher is it this planned chaos, as they have been using this kind of script in the past, um, because both Vance and Hexeth have basically broadened the area they can operate in now, and especially Trump. And I do see that in negotiations, especially if you have to negotiate with Russia, you need a certain arbitrage, and you need some ground to work on. But I think there were certainly several things that were just didn't sit right with German and European leadership. And the reaction was also basically an emergency summit called by Macron. We've discussed the lack of leadership, especially in Germany and France, and you mentioned it as well. Fully correct. And what I found interesting is that basically it wasn't only European leaders joining, but what happened was, for example, you mentioned Trudeau also joined in. And they were also kind of calling that, and saying that Turkey should have been on the table as well. So I think we can also see how different alliances are being shaped right now, instead of the NATO and, different kind of fora that might replace pre-existing ones. And I think that's not surprising, but I think that might also be a factor that the Trump administration might be underestimating right now, unless they really want to side with your Putin, your AfD. If that's the direction they wanna go to, well, yeah, there you have it. Then we have basically a new world order, which has been coming.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent point that I want to kind of, double click and underline also for, our listeners. Like many of us, like our generation, right? We grew up in the 2000s, 2010s, and we would read about the G7, G8, G20 summits, and there'd be all these family photos of all these world leaders, happily gathered together for the group photo or walking the meadows of, whichever nice resort they would be meeting at the time. And those days are over. I mean, I remember there's whatever Obama and Merkel and whatnot, and usually a pretty cordial atmosphere. It's not like a lot of things got done right in terms of hard law or hard decisions, but it was, I'm sure, in any informal way to kind of steer the conversation and the line on the global economy, on global trade, things of that nature. And I think, to your point, we're going to see new constellations, new alignments, new forums that will probably have to emerge in response to this new posture by the US. And probably a lot of these older, more well-established circles and routines and summits and groupings of countries are going to stop meeting. Or maybe they're still going to meet, but there's not going to be a lot of conversation and there's not going to be any nice, happy family photos. And that's something to keep an eye on for sure. Another element that I really liked about what you just said is pointing out this nature of the double game. So, the dual game that they might be playing. So, um, you worked in politics at the diplomatic service, and then I did as well. So I think it's important to point out that whatever an administration says in public or towards the media or on Twitter is not necessarily what they communicate in one-on-ones in bilateral meetings. And so it might well be a case of dual messaging in terms of trying to assuage or play to a certain audience at home by coming out with really strong, really intense, kind of nationalistic America First statements, but then actually behind closed doors being much more muted and being a little more mellow, we're going to talk about Ukraine, Russia in a minute. There as well, people have been saying Rubio, as Secretary of State, in his one-on-one meetings and calls with European partners, is trying to assure them that, no, we're not pivoting towards Russia. Yes, we're gonna consult with you. Yes, you are gonna have a seat at the table. But then, of course, at the same time, the Russian and the U.S. delegation are meeting in Saudi Arabia without any Europeans or Ukrainians in the room, and that creates some unease or some concern. So that will be an interesting situation to watch, how the whole Russia and Ukraine theme evolves and what the format for discussions and negotiations is going to be going forward. Right.
Absolutely, I love your point. I was attending the Digital Europe's big tech event this week in Brussels. It was beautiful. It's their landmark event, and the who's who of tech and digital in Europe in Brussels. And I can tell you those speeches basically saying like we're not going to give away our data because that's basically the oil of the 21st century. We're not going to start chipping away on our digital regulation just yet. It needs to be simplified. That was the general sentiment, which I would also underline. It needs to be simplified. It's way too complicated. It's, just bits and pieces. And there was no strategic mind behind drawing up the regulation. That's a big issue, makes it complicated for businesses, for startups to actually say, okay, I know what I need to do to be able to market in Europe. But in terms of our data and the protection of the data, we're not going to let that be chipped away. But on security and especially security spending and how we're funding our own, protection towards others, that's just common ground, and everybody agrees we haven't done enough in the past. We need to catch up, and it's time to invest heavily. And I mean, we have the big NATO summit in June. Let's see if it still exists until then. But I think that's also kind of one of these milestones and the events where we will see if we can catch up. I mean, some European countries like Poland, for example, already are spending more than the 2% target. Of course, due to their geopolitical position close to the Russian border and bordering Russia and Ukraine. And so I think that it needs to be unified also within the European Union, and the different member states need to be aligned on that. But yeah, certainly things to catch up on.
Yeah, maybe briefly on the Russia Ukraine theme to kind of close it out. Perhaps is one element that shocked Europe, as I mentioned, was just not having a seat at the table and not being invited to these initial U.S. Russia negotiations. But at the same time, I think from a U.S. perspective, it's more like, hey, there's two, maybe three major powers in the world. There's us, there's China, there's perhaps Russia. And if you want to go and deal with them or speak to them on a one-on-one basis, we're going to do that. And we don't need any, Europeans in the room in order to do that. I do think down the line, I would like to think it will be important to have formats where the Ukrainian side, the European side is somewhat involved, just to give the whole process more buy-in and more legitimacy. But we'll see. That's going to be something to keep an eye on, and I'm sure it's going to make international and global headlines, including in the U.S. I mean, Trump has been saying he might be meeting Putin within the next month or so. So we'll see if that happens. I think if it does happen, it will be a very interesting press conference and very
I would
interesting
love to be
encounter.
there.
Just times that happen, whenever those two get into a room, there's always room for debate and analysis after. But the other piece that I wanted to mention is regardless of whether or not Europe has a big stake or seat at the table in the conversation, to your point, it is going to be a big booster for accelerating European defense spending, accelerating defense tech and other developments in Europe. So I think that's almost like a positive outcome. Hopefully, fingers crossed. And another interesting piece is on a macro level, economically, it might be bullish for Europe if there is some type of peace agreement that's robust and sustainable between Russia and Ukraine. It's a fun fact. I didn't expect this, but the FT had a great piece. Financial Times had a great piece earlier this week around how European stocks have actually outperformed US stocks, not since Trump got elected, but since he got inaugurated. I think that has a lot to do with, the economic agenda of the Trump administration having some ripple effects in terms of inflation, right? We got the tariffs on aluminum, if I got it right from the top of my head. We got the tariff
Steel.
threats vis-a-vis Canada and steel. We got the tariff threats vis-a-vis Canada, Mexico, China, etc. We got potential, idea of stimulus checks that's on the table, extending the tax cuts, etc. So there's some inflationary drivers there that might be part of like the policy mix. And so that's caused some, worry about long-term growth and sustainability of growth in the US. On the European side, there's some excitement or some, bullishness towards, a better situation between Ukraine and Russia. And if that materializes, there's further room to grow for European markets and perhaps, Germany, Austria, other countries that were basically stagnating or in like small recessions the past 2, 3, 4 years can come out of that. So, I think the next 2 or 3 months are really going to be crucial to see if a robust solution that, works and is acceptable to all sides can be found. But if that works out, I do see upside for, European markets, European stocks, and the European economy down the line in, 6, 9, 12 months. So that's
Mm.
exciting.
I think it's also exciting. It makes me hope that there's still a European inside of you, Stefan. You haven't got.
Yes, there is still a European economy. So
But
yeah.
I think that the point you made about the next couple of months, what I will be watching for sure is what is the general sentiment in the US, the reactions to Trump's policy, to the executive orders, and then what the reality really means. And you mentioned, for example, tariffs on steel and aluminum. And I mean, a lot of the Rust Belt states that voted for him will be highly affected by that, especially due to the tariffs on Canada. They're not enforced yet. We know they got like this, kind of 1 month to figure things out. But those states, and especially the people who voted for Trump, will be affected by that over the long term. And so I personally think that also the back and forth, also on the geopolitical level, by the Trump administration right now might hurt the US and over the long term, because we've talked about that. I mean, if you're deciding where you want to be headed and have your headquarters as a business, you need certain, being able to plan and have a planning capacity for your own business endeavors. And I think we've discussed this was an interesting graph. We can put that into the show notes as well. If you compare the GDP between the EU and US, obviously EU is lagging behind. But then if you account for the Fed and ECB rate hikes, and also if you account for the purchasing power per person, we're not that far behind. So I'm still hopeful, and it's going to be a grand time for Europe if we figure a couple of things out.
No, let me tell you, I mean, cost of living is obviously through the roof in most of the geographies that I spend time in,
Mm,
for instance, New York City or San Francisco. And then the value you get, right, the quality of, food or other types of goods you consume is not always on par with what you can find in European capitals. So there is hope for Europe, and Europe still has a lot of things going for it. Maybe to go back to Europe as well, we wanted to touch briefly on the German election, which is happening this Sunday, and offer a bit of an outlook there. So, Veronica, what's your take on the German election this week?
yeah, wow, exciting times. For those who are not that familiar with European politics and dynamics, that's the most important election this year. Let's see what's happening, if there are any more snap elections, but that's the most important election this year. I would even say it's as important as the European Parliament's election, just because of the importance of the powerhouse Germany, or I have to say the former powerhouse. We've discussed that the German economy has been lagging behind, and they have tried to recover both from the COVID pandemic, the energy crisis, and also certain shifts in their industry. So especially the auto industry and automobile has been hit by several impacts in the past, and they've been grappling and trying to figure out to find new ventures and to diversify as well. So we are right now looking at the polls. We're expecting the center-right conservative. I would say they have been compared to Republicans. It's a different story under the Trump Republicans, but they have been linked mostly to the Republicans' Conservative Party at 28%. Then the far right AfD, we've mentioned them before, who's highly scrutinized due to their links to the neo-Nazi scene at 21%, and SPD, which is a socialist party, at 16%. The question will be if the FDP, a libertarian party, will survive and if they will be entering the parliament, the Bundestag. They were part of the former government, which was a so-called traffic light government formed of three parties, which is very unheard of for the US, of course, because to reach the threshold of 50%, you need the votes or the electorates of the corresponding parties. And I mentioned the AFB just a second ago, and I think it might be interesting to go into a little bit more detail because also JD Vance talked about the so-called firewall, he called it. It's the Brandmauer. It's kind of an agreement among parties in Germany, and similar kind of agreements exist in other European countries, not to team up with far-right parties. You have to see that in a cultural and historical context of Europe due to World War II and, of course, the terrible things that happened during the Holocaust and our shared history. And it is something that has been discussed broadly, especially for conservative parties, because I would say you have two different positions here, where one side is saying that this just helps far-right parties to be more attractive because they can position themselves as a victim and kind of being the only ones who are speaking the truth, whereas others say you need to, draw a line and say that this is a different political opinion and they can exist, and of course they can be voted. It doesn't mean that they're censored in any way, but we do not want to team up with them. In my opinion, it highly depends on the different countries, which approach makes more sense, because those parties are kind of scattered. They do have a shared political group on a European level, so there is a collaboration and has been improving over the last years. But for the far rights, that has been the case in the past. And the German government, the previous one I mentioned, it was made up of three parties. The overall sentiment is that they're one of the main reasons why the German economy is not thriving, and they have missed the opportunity to rebuild it and to do the right stimuli after the COVID pandemic and to help the German economy. The most likely scenario is right now a coalition between the center conservative, the CDU and CSU, with the socialists, which would be a centered government. And then they would add someone else in to reach that 50% threshold. Friedrich Merz, who is the leader, the successor after Angela Merkel, we've mentioned her before, he has already confirmed that he will not form a government with the AfD, but their appeal certainly is due to their very strict approach to migration. It's as in a lot of European countries, I might say in all of European countries, migration is one of the key topics in every election right now. And they're promising that they would be able to solve that by deporting people who are not wanted in Germany anymore. That's kind of in a nutshell what we're looking at in Germany right now. the importance, as I mentioned, of the German election is also because of the lack of leadership on a European level. So the hope is that whoever becomes the next chancellor, most likely Friedrich Merz, will take back the helm and make sure that Europe has a united front and speaks with at least one or two voices and not five, like the moment as it seems. Will be glued to all media outlets and the live tickers on Sunday, because that's a big one, and it will be very important for us that a new government is formed as quickly as possible, also to jump into the negotiations with the US and also, of course, in looking at Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you for giving us some, local context and color there. I just want to highlight maybe one element, which is, yeah, to your point, like given what it looks like in the polls right now, it's going to be pretty tight. And, the two major mainstream parties who've like run the country between the two of them ever since World War II, basically, might not even have enough votes to get there or to form a like sustainable coalition. So that goes to show how much the far right and the far left have managed to capture a very large share and percentage of the vote. So yeah, I think one thing I'm going to look out for is there a clear majority, which would be very important in terms of both executing on a domestic agenda, which the previous administration did not do, and having a bigger position within the EU and in terms of foreign policy internationally, also facing the United States. Or is it going to be almost like a hung parliament or another free party situation and coalition where it's going to be very hard to get things done? And I think that would be not ideal, both for Germany and for the world. So let's keep our fingers crossed and see what happens on Sunday. We're going to be back and break it down for you in our next conversation.
I can't wait. It's going to be exciting.
100%, as always. Veronica, good to see you. Catch up.
It was great, Stefan. See you at TTT number 4.